First of all, I'm a cradle Catholic. I'm from a Catholic family, and I'm one of 8 kids. I'm 6 of 8, and so being Catholic is all I've ever known. My parents were devout Catholics, and we went to church every Sunday, and so it was just simply part of life. Went to Mass every Sunday, went to Catholic schools from first grade through really through high school and then college. So it was the lifeblood of our family. It was normal. We said grace before meals. We celebrated Advent and Lent, and so it was a part of our just a natural part of our family growing up, like many Catholic families. How to witness of other Black Catholics? I think again, as a young person, particularly again growing up, the witness was my parents, and a family that they practiced the faith. It was precious to them, important to them. So of course it was naturally important to us. I think as I learned more about our history, the history of Catholicism, Black Catholics in particular, I think realizing the reality of segregation, the idea that even from again, not just the history books, but even from our own family, we're sitting in St. Augustine Catholic Church, which was originally built as St. Paul's Church. Well, my uncle this is a church that he was put out of when he came and sat in the front pew, and was asked to move, and he refused to move, so they escorted him out of the church. And just knowing that the passion of my own relatives, my uncles and aunts, who loved the faith, and yet, they loved it so much that the reality of discrimination, segregation didn't scare them away. They only seemed to double down, to insist that they're going to practice the faith and they're going to pass the faith on to their to their children. And so really the witness of my own family, even before learning the bigger story of how Catholics, were heroically, it was an act of heroism to practice your faith as a African American, as a Black person in this country. So as I was, again, my family, I'm one of 8, 6 of 8, and my parents put us all through Catholic school from first grade on. There was actually no kindergarten, so my 1 year in public school was kindergarten, and then Catholic education all after that. And one of the things that has played such an important part in my life, again, recognizing first, again, how passionate the Catholic faith of my parents was. My mother and father, and I didn't know this when I was younger, but I learned that they never went to Catholic school because Catholic schools were segregated. And so they didn't have the opportunity to go to Catholic school at all. And however, they learned their faith they said they went to Saturday school. They learned their faith at their parish, Holy Redeemer, and that's where they learned their faith. But clearly they insisted when they had children, they were going to give their children an opportunity that they never had. And so they made sure all 8 of us went to Catholic schools from first grade on through high school, and most of us through college. And it's meant, it's really helped form me. I mean, I'm a priest today because of my foundation, my Catholic foundation. And so Catholic education I'm passionate about it because of my own experience. And so, as a priest, of course, I don't have my own family, I'm spouse and children, but I'm here at St. Augustine Catholic School. I've been here for 16 years, and, these are my children, and so to have the opportunity, I could see just as my parents were passionate about seeing that their children got a Catholic education, I've had the opportunity to impact the lives of hundreds of children in these past 16 years by making sure that the Catholic education was available to them. So doing everything we could to make the cost of tuition not a barrier, but of course having a strong Catholic identity. I did bring religious sisters back to St. Augustine, and so it's been a proud way for me to continue the legacy of my parents in a little different way, but in a way that because they invested in me and my brothers and sisters, I've been able to invest in hundreds of children as a pastor at St. Augustine and seeing that they receive a great Catholic education like I did. Being pastor of St. Augustine Parish back in 2004, again, I knew, just knowing the history here, started in 1858, not really as the community existed as a community of faith that was basically living out of the basement of St. Matthew's as a chapel. The first building they built, they didn't build a church. The first thing they built was a school. Had school in homes, and then eventually have been building larger spaces to have a school. So you can't tell the story of St. Augustine Catholic Church in D.C. without beginning with Catholic education, Catholic schools. And remember, think of the date, 1858. Slavery ended 1865. So this is, but slavery was still going on. So there was no education for black children. As a matter of fact, it was not legal to have, schools for black children. That did not deter the founders of St. Augustine Church, that their first priority is we are going to educate our children, even at whatever risk that would be. But it was simply something that they were so convicted, this was imperative. We have to educate our children. We need to pass on the Catholic faith, and so they did. And so whenever we face challenges over the past, almost 170 years, that we always had to look back at our ancestors who, at an even more difficult time, again, when slavery was still going on, with all the obstacles of racism and discrimination, that they still endured, that their passion for the Catholic faith was so strong, and particularly their passion on passing it on. They were so committed to do that the obstacles were not going to deter them. And I tell you, that's been that continues to be today a great source of encouragement and in faith, to know that what we have in common with our ancestors is that they put their faith in God, and the same God that supported them and gave them what they needed to do what they needed to do, that same God is with us, a God who will always give us everything we need to do everything He requires. As we're again coming up to celebrate the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, first of all, Dr. King himself, obviously not a Catholic but Baptist minister, has always been, for my even early years, he was killed in 1968. I was born in 1963. So, but I have memories of, the household being different, and I can imagine just as with the news of his assassination and just how that impacted our families and the country. But all I remember was his speech at the time the night before he died, about going up to the mountaintop and I want to do God's will, and seemingly just his courage, and knowing that he was killed the next day, realizing he had got death threats. So as a man of faith, he really impacted me as one that this was a person with real faith, that he wasn't scared away by even the threats of his life. And so part of, obviously, not just a black Catholic, but a black American, certainly, obviously, the part of our Catholic faith is our faith. And so that has continued to inspire me and encourage me as living my life out as a priest. I think that the reality is, one of the things that Dr. King said was, the early church was like a thermostat to society. I mean, if you think of, but today it seems more like a thermometer. If you think about, thermostat sets the standard, sets the temperature, in a sense, challenge the environment to come up to the standard. Of course, a thermometer just reflects what is. If it's hot, it says it's hot. If it's unjust and racist, then it just reflects it. And I think that part of reality is too often times where as a church, over history, we've, rather than being a thermostat to challenge the standard of the gospel, set the standard and challenge the environment to come up to it. There are too many cases where, again, situations where instead of doing that, we just reflect it. So public schools are segregated, Catholic schools are segregated. Again, my own parents couldn't get a Catholic education because Catholic schools would not permit them because of the color of their skin. So, and the reality is that today, many times that if we see Catholic schools close en masse across the country, many times it's not necessarily an intentional, a deliberate intent to simply disenfranchise black children. But the reality is that I do think the church has a responsibility to know the history and realize that for a long, long time, church leaders deliberately, intentionally, strategically kept black children from getting a Catholic education. And with that kind of history, there's, I think, a greater obligation to see to it that we do everything we can to make sure that we do give them the education that had been deprived. Now, maybe today it's more because of costs and economics, but I think we owe something. It's called repairing what we have done, to make every effort we can to make sure that the very people who were denied intentionally a Catholic education, that we do everything we can and see ourselves having an obligation to make sure that they get that education today. And I personally believe I've worked so hard to make sure that while schools have closed all across the country, including in this diocese, that St. Augustine continue, that we still do everything we can to make sure that children today get the great education that my parents made sure I had, so that they too can make a profound impact on the society that they go out to when they graduate from here. Well, my reaction to, again, the reality of, with the nationwide protests since, let's say, since March or even before, many sparked by the killing of George Floyd by a police officer, again, the horrific, the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that was seen around the world, that literally I couldn't, I lost my appetite. I couldn't eat for 24 hours. It was so horrific, and I think that there was obviously a sense of this is just intolerable, this cannot continue. Of course, there have been many other cases of deaths of African Americans, men and women, who are unarmed. And I think that, so I think as a pastor, part of my responsibility, when I see my parishioners also agonizing over and frustrated and angry, I'm always trying to help guide them, what is God doing to help us not just cope with or be comforted or encouraged, but how are we called to respond? We know that the Lord calls us obviously to charity and forgiveness, but also calls us to justice. And so one of the things that I did, I tried to provide opportunities for our parishioners to talk about and see how we can respond. We joined when the Archdiocese of Washington encouraged Catholic leaders and Catholic parishioners to march down near the White House to really make it known that we are standing up for the lives of all people, including Black lives. And so it's so important that we not just talk about it, preach about it, write about it, but we knew we had to actually take action and do something. Here at St. Augustine, we organized a forum, basically a virtual town hall meeting to talk about racial injustice. We entitled it, "Racial Injustice and Disparity," and from Catholic social teaching to Catholic social action, and to Catholic moral action. And so I think that so we as a community have tried to continue to do our part in, one, addressing the issue, also calling on part of that presentation of the virtual town hall meeting was also to encourage also leaders and call as Catholic leaders how we as a church, cannot get blindsided or muted by partisan politics, but simply look at the reality. People. When we say, that the lives of Black people matter, it is a simple fact that is completely backed up by our faith. The lives of, and just with understanding, if there's any group that feels the need to scream, hey, my life matters, rather than being suspicious, we should say, well, why? Well, why are they screaming? Because if I'm a person that believes, like as we profess in our faith, the dignity of all human life, if any group is not being shown that dignity, they're going to scream out. So every January, one of the things that we've been doing for almost 30 years in Washington is there is an Unborn Lives Matter March. That's what I'm calling it. Unborn, UBM, Unborn Lives Matter. And why do we feel the need? If we believe all lives matter, why do we feel it? Because we have to have a march or speak out. Well, it's the same with Black lives or elderly lives or disabled people's lives. If they're being neglected, then of course they're going to scream out. And I think our attitude should be to listen, to show empathy, and to respond. We know this. The scripture is clear. The Lord hears the cry of the poor, all of them. There is no politician that does. So it's not about partisanship. That when anybody is whoever we vote for, or it's like whoever we vote for, well, there's some lives that they're not going to hear. And I feel we have a moral obligation to speak up for the lives that they don't hear on either side. So it's so important that we do not, I think part of my concern is that, especially when it comes to race and racism, and that we get caught up in, that if we take a side on partisan politics, that we basically fully embrace and join someone who's ignoring some people's lives. And so on either side, I think it's so important that we remember Jesus is not Democrat or Republican. He calls himself the truth. And whatever is true, we need to hold up, and especially the truth of the lives of the dignity of all human lives, whatever their race or age or location or whatever it is. But we need to stand up for them all. Part of the obviously impact of just racism across the board is where certain people are, again, if you look at so many elements that affect our society, that they're often disproportionately represented in people of color, who disproportionately represent the poor and the lower economic side of things. And so, so when it comes to anything, when it comes to income, employment, or certainly healthcare, well, obviously with the advent of the coronavirus, that those who's no surprise that people of color are impacted, that the impact is more great on them as far as sickness and death. I mean, if healthcare is already poor, then certainly battling a pandemic, they're going to be more disproportionately impacted. Besides healthcare, also the fact that people of color are more represented among essential workers. You know, folks who cannot shelter in place and work from home and online. You know, they have to go into work. They have to interact with people. And so, not surprisingly, their lives have been put at more risk than the lives of many others in a different position. So, I think so we see that how even the reality of racism and discrimination have impacted the lives of those who've been affected by coronavirus. I can tell you as a pastor here in Washington, D.C., it's, if there's anyone out there still thinking that coronavirus is a hoax, I can tell you from the beginning, I see the concrete reality. I look at all the funerals that I've had to do, all the parishioners I've lost, lifelong parishioners, active parishioners, not just the elderly, and who are no longer here. And I'm just one pastor of one church, and I can tell you how the impact on many lives have been impacted through contracting the virus and then sadly in so many cases dying from the virus. So I see how just this one community has been impacted. And so if we multiply that by hundreds of thousands of communities around the country, that there's been a disproportionate impact in Black communities. So that's it's a true reality that and I think that I simply that we've had to deal with. And as always, really invoking our faith and our God to help us to not be discouraged, to not fall into despair, but also to do what we can. Again, we've also had forums to talk about the impact of coronavirus and how we can respond. And maybe today also, just as we're seeing some hopeful developments with vaccines, there's a history among a history of this country and among Black Americans, where there's a suspicion about when it comes to things like government medical care or government vaccines, and there's whether you've had the famous, infamous Tuskegee experiments, where Black people were sort of used as guinea pigs, as lab rats, to test things, and whether people were left sterile because of it, or so there's a suspicion. But we certainly, I think the biggest antidote to fear is facts, is truth. I mean, that, and so I do our part, and I encourage our leaders to do their part also with informing folks about where how vaccines were developed, and just the information they need to know that it is safe. And so we're encouraging, again, precisely because it's so needed in our community. We certainly don't want our folks to be hesitant to taking advantage as those vaccines are made available. We're definitely encouraging them to definitely take advantage of it. And again, our main way of doing that is really battling the fear with facts. As as Cardinal Gregory has talked about, not only the pandemic of the coronavirus, but also that of the pandemic of racism. I think one of the things as a church, I mentioned that I think it's so important that we don't get caught up in partisan politics. We need to, first of all, teaching our faith and practicing our faith. We have, our teaching is, whether it's Catholic social teaching, the teaching about the dignity of all human beings, the fact that we, again, called to be that thermostat that sets the standard, we've always existed to call the society to evangelize, to go to every nation, and in this nation, and many times, again, we get caught up in our own, our partisan politics and ignore the cries of the poor. I think that as a church, first of all, as a teaching church, that first of all, to acknowledge the reality of racism. I think that many times We may talk about it. We have many documents that say, racism is a sin. It's contrary to the teaching human dignity, but that is simply not enough. First of all, those cases were stating the obvious, but so sometimes I think rather than just focusing on racism, we need to talk more about racial justice. Justice, when we get into morality, justice tends to be about what are you doing? What are you doing that's either disenfranchising people and discriminating, or what are you doing to counteract it? Because many times we'll say, yeah, racism bad, we shouldn't do that, that's not what we're about, amen. But not acknowledging that when we do see it, what do we do to counteract it? I think that, things like, whether we're talking about, again, providing opportunities for education for all people and making that available, whether just again, being aware and acknowledging the reality even within our own community, whether it comes to hiring practices, do we favor certain people over other people? I think that, when we, even so as a church, we have the greater and higher responsibility, and we have a history. If you think about many times in the past, we've confused, colonization with evangelization, that where we pass on, a culture to, let's say, in missionary work, but where that becomes more important than the actual message of the gospel. I think even today that, we live in a society, we have and we're from whatever our backgrounds are, but it's so important. I think one key thing is that we, all of us who've taken American history in this country got a heavily redacted version, meaning so much of the history of whether the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, the history of Reconstruction, we just were never taught. And so we have oftentimes, we look at the reality of racism today and acts of injustice and violence, police brutality, discrimination, other forms, and or mass incarceration. And we just, because we don't know our history, we just conclude, well, I guess people are, black people are more prone to criminality, and so I guess that's why there's so many in jail. But if you know the history, you realize that there's a whole history between the police and black people, that the first police in many ways were slave catchers. When you look at how did they continue this amazing economic institution called slavery, of free labor, how did they keep that going after emancipation? And so just knowing the history of that, for example, of how basically the collaboration, I call the diabolical collaboration of police, the courts, and big business, is how they kept free labor going. And so rather than, since it was illegal to enslave people, there was the exception in the 13th Amendment was unless they've committed a crime. So if you simply read the history, you'll see how, especially in the South, where that there were mass arrests of people of color after slavery, often at peculiar times like harvest season, mass arrest. And well, why was that? Because and what they would do is they'd be arrested for misdemeanors. Well, you can go to court records today. It wasn't murder, it wasn't rape, it wasn't horrible crime. It was spitting on the sidewalk, talking to a white woman, loitering, and you had mass arrests happening. And what would happen was they were misdemeanors, so there'd be a fine. And so someone would be charged a fine, $5 fine. I don't have $5. Well, guess what? Who else would be in the courtroom? You'd have the business owner saying, I'll pay the $5. You got to work for me. And literally, it was an ingenious, clever, diabolical scheme, but it worked. And that's how you had. So that's just a little short lesson in history. So we have responsibility as leaders, especially as church, know the history. And so because otherwise it'd be very easy to demonize a group of people. They have mass arrests today because they must be prone to a criminality. If you know the history, then you realize that how the criminal justice system was often acting in a criminal way, and how it was used to actually and sort of to really disenfranchise a certain group of people, black people, for economic use. And so that's not a new phenomenon. I think if we simply know the history, that's just one example. There are many other examples of how even the government and our policies, people against often don't like affirmative action, but affirmative action was a normal thing exclusively for white Americans and citizens. The Homestead Act, the GI Bill, the New Deal, where these were opportunities that were given by the government to give people a boost. Whether you're coming out from the war or whether you need money to buy land, because of discrimination, people of color were excluded. And so here you had the government giving handouts exclusively to white people. And it made all the difference in the world. They needed it. They got money for education, for getting a home loan, for being able to buy a home, to get a loan from the bank. Many opportunities that African Americans simply never had. And so today you have economic disparities that you can trace back to many of those policies that intentionally kept people of color, at a disadvantage. And those disadvantages, many of those disadvantages still exist today. First of all, the critical distinction between the content of our faith and those who are delivering it. The distinction between the message and the messenger. Clearly, what I've seen and am always inspired by is when I look at the history of Catholicism, particularly in this country, of Black Catholics. Quite frankly, it reads much of our leaders, let's say like the first priests, who that were ordained in this country, and our religious sisters, how it reads like, if you read their stories, it reads like a martyrology, martyrs. People who, despite discrimination, despite violence, despite the threat of violence and death threats, they continue to practice the faith. They continue to go to church when they were, but they had to sit in the back of the church. They could go to Mass, but they had to go to communion last, or they had to sit in the balcony. So even in the face of these forms of discrimination, the refusal to ordain Black priests, they wouldn't allow them in the seminaries. But the perseverance, and clearly it wasn't because of the faith in this particular bishop or that particular leader or that particular pastor. It's because, thanks be to God, they really did get the faith. They learned about the truth of the gospel, the Eucharist, and believed in it. That's why my parents passed it on. Remember, my parents were denied a Catholic education, Catholic school education. But they did everything they could and made every sacrifice to make sure their children got that same Catholic education. It wasn't because of their faith in simply the leaders. It was their faith in the gospel and the faith in the message of the gospel. And so we know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He's a good shepherd. He's faithful. He's a faithful one, and we fell in love with him, and with this in the life-saving message. And so, despite so even when the church leaders failed, we knew God would never fail. And that is still the same faith that sustains me. My faith is in him. And he's the one that called me to be a priest, to stand as persona Christi. So again, I'm in love with the Mass, and in Christ who's present. So I believe in him, and I believe he's present. And he promised never to leave us or forsake us, that he walks with us. He's a good shepherd. Any good shepherd does at least three things. A good shepherd will feed you, give you what you need. A good shepherd will lead and guide you, so you don't go astray or get lost. And a good shepherd will watch over and protect you. So I think that's been really key to, as many Black Catholics who, despite the adversity, have continued to really maintain the faith. It's really because that we've made a distinction between, as I think we all do, and I hope people do that with me, that I am a messenger, but I'm not the message. If I fall and fail, I don't want you to fall and fail because of me. St. Francis de Sales put it, he said, that whenever, a person causes scandal, they're guilty, a priest or a religious leader causes scandal, they're guilty of a spiritual homicide. But he says, but don't you let that be a reason for you to commit spiritual suicide. And I think that the greatest scandal for Black Catholics has been racism. And it's meaning scandal, obstacle. What blocks you from embracing the faith? There's been nothing greater than racism that has been the scandal to keep people from the faith. And there is not a day in my ministry of over 30 years that I am not trying to counteract that particular scandal, so that people do not deprive themselves of the life-saving message of Christ, of the Blessed Sacrament, of the Catholic faith, because of the scandal of racism. When I heard the news that Pope Francis had appointed Cardinal, first of all, Archbishop Gregory to Washington, first of all, being the first Archbishop over the capital of the nation, that was certainly, again, a source of great encouragement and great celebration within the Black Catholic community. When he also then elevated Archbishop Gregory to Cardinal, again, being the first Cardinal, Black American Cardinal in the history of the United States. Honestly, I will tell you, I had two feelings. One, that it was certainly something that, that it was very positive, very good, and I think very important that, that again, not by the actions of the Pope, by appointing Gregory, Archbishop Gregory Cardinal, it made a statement that really that by action that in fact that while the reality of racism has always been an obstacle to Black Americans being leaders in the church, meaning that they had all the qualifications, but because they were Black, they didn't get appointed. So whether it was Blacks couldn't go to seminaries, religious could not join Black women could not join certain religious orders. The only reason was because they're Black. Pope Francis, by appointing Cardinal Gregory, has said that, has made it explicitly clear, in no clear way has said that the color of his skin will not be a reason. It will no longer be a deterrent, or a disqualifying reality for him serving in the church. And but I said it in the beginning that I had mixed reaction, because certainly the other reaction was, why in the world did it take so long? Again, the church is supposed to have different standards. We're not supposed to simply reflect society, but challenge society to a higher standard. And I'm glad it happened, but I'm sorry it took so long for the church to do what it should have done a long time ago.